It is the top of the hour, so we're going to begin our next edition on the series of digital dialogues on racial justice, inclusion, and diversity. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Charlie Arnott. I am the CEO of the Center for Food Integrity, and it is my pleasure to join you in collaboration with our partner, the FMI, the Food Industry Association. David Fikes will offer some welcoming comments in just a moment from them. But on behalf of CFI and our member organization, it is our pleasure to invite you to this ongoing series and discussions about how we can continue to improve our performance on diversity, equity, and inclusion across the food system. We bring you a series of experts who have a phenomenal amount of experience and expertise in this topic. And we've continued to see this conversation evolve over the last 18 months from who are we and how do we think about this? How do we begin to talk about it to what are we actually going to do? And what actions are we taking within our organizations to improve our performance? We have two absolutely exceptional speakers today who will be sharing their experience and their expertise. And we also encourage you to get actively engaged in the conversation and submit your questions through the Q&A or the chat button at the bottom of your screen, whichever is most comfortable for you. And Ayanna Webster, our outstanding facilitator, will continue to engage and we'll take as many of your questions as we possibly can. So again, thank you so much for joining us for this ongoing conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's our pleasure to be a co-host. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague and friend, David Fikes, for their introduction and welcome.
Thanks so much, Charlie. It is FMI's absolute pleasure to co-sponsor this with CFI and appreciate them extending us the opportunity to partner with them on this very important endeavor. So let me add my own welcome to this fifth installment of the food industry's digital dialogues. FMI remains committed to these dialogues basically as a means of promoting healthy and productive conversations in the workplace about the important issues of racial justice and inclusion and diversity. We think these are absolutely critical conversations, not only at the webinar level, but also in the boardrooms and in the break rooms across our industry. In a world where we seem to be increasingly prone to only surrounding ourselves with those who vote like us, or earn like us, or spend like us, or look like us, or are educated in the same way, or worship like us, we become susceptible to living in that world of empathy deficit. We all have our biases, but when we opt to only have those biases reinforced by those who share similar bias, we fail to exercise our empathy muscles, and over time, they atrophy like all muscles. Ultimately, that would limit our worldviews, narrows our perspectives, it cripples our capacity to think outside of ourselves, and it also cripples our ability to even think and reflect imaginatively. We are committed to these conversations because we deem it important that we all learn to acknowledge the bias that we hold and to discover and practice the empathetic means of moving beyond them. We see these dialogues as powerful opportunities to exercise our ability to empathize, to understand what another might be feeling, to feel what another might be feeling, and then be moved to provide meaningful help. So looking forward to this dialogue today, and welcome, and thank you for expanding your own worldview by joining us today.
David, thank you so much for that great welcome, and certainly appreciate the ongoing partnership. And again, just as a reminder, as a housekeeping function, please submit your questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of the toolbar here on the ubiquitous Zoom. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce once again our facilitator, Ayanna Webster, who will lead the rest of the program. Ayanna, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Charlie. Thanks, David. Well, good afternoon again, and thank you everyone for joining us. As Charlie said, my name is Ayanna Webster, and I have the distinct privilege to lead today's afternoon's dialogue. And so with that, I'd like to just jump right into the conversation by doing introductions and having our panelists to introduce themselves. So what I would like for our panelists to do is just to share with our audience today why this conversation on racial inclusion, justice, and diversity is specifically, why is it important to you? And so we'll start with our first panelist, Natasha.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I'm Natasha Miller-Williams. I'm the head of diversity, equity, and inclusion at Farrar Candy Company. Sometimes people don't recognize the name Farrar, but you do recognize our many yummy brands, Now and Later, Sweet Tarts, Boston Baked Beans, just to name a few. And I really appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to be with you today. So why this conversation is important to me, I won't make this the longest walk around the park, but I feel like I have to start at the beginning because it does start at the beginning for me, the beginning of my career when I joined my first organization as a college grad. And I didn't see a lot of people that looked like me at the organization, in the meetings, even when I was visiting my client site. And it really created a lot of feelings of isolation, thinking about what the opportunity for progression would be for me in my career. I certainly had ambition to move into executive positions. But what I saw in leadership ranks, it had me believing that success might be limited to a specific type of person or a specific profile because the representation wasn't there. And so my start into this work was just through volunteerism around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and just wanting to be one of those individuals that was thinking proactively about how the organization that I was a part of could advance its own efforts around DE&I. And I wore that second hat for many years, the first decade of my career, and then had a formal opportunity to move into this work full time. And now that I have, I would say, matured as a professional, matured in my understanding of diversity and inclusion, and I would say equity as well, because I wasn't really thinking about equity. It wasn't that much a part of my vocabulary. More than 20 years ago when I started this work, I have broadened to not just only be thinking about representation, of course, but to think more about what is the corporate responsibility for the communities where we live and work, to build an inclusive culture, as well as thinking about what each of us can do as individuals. So when you ask me my why, it started around representation, but it has really expanded to what our corporations can do for where we live and work.
Absolutely. Thank you, Natasha. Kevin.
Sure, thank you for having me today. I guess I would say that my why also began several years ago. My family are Jamaican immigrants. We moved here from Jamaica 32 years ago. And on the one hand, I will say that we've had a chance to really build our American dream in some respect. I'm here on this call speaking to you. But I will say that that journey was wrought with navigating spaces that I thought were not really made for me, quite frankly. I was, for many, many years, the first or the only or one of few. I recall my first job after college. I was on day one of my job after college in a massive company here in the US, the second highest ranked Black man in the company as a new college graduate, right? And so therefore, I recall many, many years of going through different scenarios where I was trying to create new culture. And I do recall where if those spaces were more inclusive, I could have gone so much more further than I had gone because my energy was spent on fitting into things that I wasn't meant to be a part of. But I also learned too very early the power of mentoring. I was mentored very heavily along the way in my youth coming up. And I learned that while on the one hand, there were places where I was feeling awkward or alone, there was someone else who would say, here, take my hand, come with me and pull me forward. And therefore I learned the power of, while I step forward, pull somebody else with me along the way. And therefore this dialogue to me is part of how we can both on the one hand break through individually, but help our community advance as well and realize their dream as well. I will say last year with the advent of COVID and George Floyd's murder, things for me also went to a whole new level. And I recall after we were seeing our people, at home with COVID fears happening, and then the confusion after seeing Mr. Floyd killed. And we convened a call with our employees to ask them, quite frankly, tell us in words, in writing, how do you feel? And one thing that we saw was that all of our employees, whether they were Black, white, Latin, or whatever it was, they wanted to feel human again. They want to have a chance to process and discuss all of these things in a more humane way and not feel that we're at war with each other through all of this. And therefore, for me, as a leader, it is my job to make sure that wherever I go, I make a space so everyone can feel truly like they belong and that we are humans first and we can unleash our best selves in our spaces together. So there goes my story of my why.
Thank you, Kevin. And I heard those themes of representation as both of you entered the workforce and that the themes around inclusion. So hopefully, again, as we get questions from our audience, we'll get to hear about your stories and again, how you're making a difference in your companies. So as we move into some of the questions that I have for you all, I would like for us to begin, as we do with each of our dialogue sessions, with just reviewing the 4 agreements of courageous conversation. So as we know, sometimes these topics can be difficult subjects to discuss. And so with that in mind, we'd like to engage today and create an empowered, a safe environment to have a conversation today around these topics. So we start with these 4 agreements that we would just ask that all would consider as we have this conversation. The first here you'll see is that we ask that our panelists and our audience stay engaged. We ask that you remain fully and wholly committed to the dialogue, resisting what we know is human nature, perhaps to disengage based off of what we hear or what we don't hear. Secondly, experience discomfort. We again acknowledge that these conversations can be uncomfortable for many of us. However, talking about them is really what removes the divide and it brings us together. And here is where we can begin, not only just talking about meaningful change, but also putting things in place to create meaningful change. Third, speak your truth. Again, I'll say speak your truth. Simply put, that means let's be open about our thoughts and feelings, not simply saying or asking questions that we think our panelists want to be asked or what our audience wants to hear. We want to, again, be able to have each individual feel comfortable to speak their truth and their experiences and ask the questions that are on their hearts today. And then finally, we would ask that you would accept and expect that even after today's hour that we have together, that there is going to be some level of non-closure. And so in our desire for real change and healing, it's normal that we'll want to rush to some quick solutions. However, we acknowledge that today is a beginning and it's an opportunity again for us to have a dialogue that informs the necessary, meaningful action that should and can take place as a result of what we hear and learn today. So I thank you all in advance for participating in the discussion today with these agreements in mind. With that, I would like to begin with a first question that I have right off the top for Natasha. And so Natasha, we heard your why, and so thank you for sharing your experience as a young woman coming into the workforce. We heard your personal why, but the question I would really like to begin with you is, can you take it a step further and tell me, in your opinion, why more than ever should the industry specifically care about and address diversity and inclusion?
Yeah. Thank you for asking the question. It is one I'm excited to answer. When I think about the food industry, it's so interesting. This morning, I was actually on a call with the new hire class. We're doing our virtual new hire onboardings, and there are people who joined the organization from a variety of different industries, and we were all talking about our path to get to, Ferrara or into the food industry. And this topic actually came up, and I knew that you and I would be talking about it today. And what I shared is that food is an industry that everyone participates in. And so while some of us may have come from, I actually came from information measurement before Ferrara, and some people had come from auto or finance or tech. We were kind of like sharing all of our different backgrounds, but here we are all together in food, an industry that, independent of, age, gender, race, whoever and whatever you are, there's not a person that's not eating. And so the opportunity that we really have as food manufacturers or as retailers, we're in every household, every age, every person is participating. And we have platforms at shelf, through our advertising, through our packaging, and through our brands to connect with our consumers around these topics, whether it is the topic of racial justice or inclusion or other societal issues. And we know that consumers want to hear from the brands that they are purchasing on these topics. And, I could start to rattle off some statistics, and maybe I actually will, about some of this, but we know that it brings consumers closer to the brand when they actually hear from the brand, from the manufacturer about these topics that matter. And so I think that's the first thing, that, we have that penetration to connect because of the industry that we are in. And I go so far as to say a responsibility to really step up and take a stance and have a point of view, that our consumers respect the brands that are willing to, have a position or belief on the topics that matter. I'll go one step further from an industry perspective. I spent a lot of time just researching our industry compared to some of the other industries that have, put out workforce data or made points of view. If you think about tech and banking, and they are typically ranked on some of the best in class lists for diversity and inclusion. And often you don't really see CPG or fast moving consumer goods or retailers on those best in class lists. Not that we're not doing great work. And so you'll often see top talent looking at those lists, and they are prioritizing the companies where they want to work based on those lists alone. And so I also think that we really have an opportunity from a talent pipeline perspective to be out there addressing these issues and prioritizing diversity, equity, and inclusion when we even think about talent that's coming into our industry and coming into our space, because CPG does sometimes lose talent to other industries, particularly diverse talent. Deloitte recently did a study, and millennials ranked manufacturing as their least preferred career destination. And you think about the opportunity that we have and all of the different careers that we have within our industry and the ways that we can connect specifically around DEI. I'll wrap it up by saying that, going back where I started, that people are making a decision around where they want to work. And 70% of Black workers choose a job based on whether or not they take a stance on racial justice alone. And so if we don't have a responsibility for any other reason, it's for our employees, it's for our customers, and it's for the communities that we serve.
Wow. And just to think that this morning, that is a topic of conversation in your onboarding this morning around diversity and inclusion and the efforts that are happening in your company. And so when you talk about that 70%, you absolutely can tell that it is something that the industry needs to be thinking about from, as you said, a talent acquisition perspective. So thank you for sharing all of those reasons why the industry needs to be thinking about and talking and having meaningful action around the topic. Kevin, I want to move over to you and ask, as we think about the industry and perhaps what's happening in your workforce, can you talk a little bit about what is being done to address diversity, equity, and inclusion, and maybe some of the results that you all are finding?
Sure, thanks, Iana. I guess the first thing I'll say for context is that, in our work, we don't make things, right? We have people who spend all of their time serving clients. And so our value comes from people who show up to work every day, who have to make a choice to be their full and best self. And so we have about 4,000 employees here in the US who are impacted by all of this. And if they aren't coming to work with a sense of belonging in what they do, then they can't serve our clients well. So we have no choice but to make sure that our employees are coming to work and feeling a sense of belonging. What I think has happened, we've been on a journey for a long time with D&I at EY, had some great success so far, had to up our game last year. And we look at D&I in the context of the folks who work inside of our company, our clients, people, but also our communities outside of work. And several things we've seen that works. I think last year, we have begun to really underscore the power of conversations, even alongside the power of having the right programs and goals. I think D&I is most effective when it's truly authentic inside of a personal relationship where people are seeing each other, as you heard earlier in the comments, not as a demographic, but as a person who has hopes, dreams, goals, fears, and potential to be unleashed as well in the workplace. And therefore, we empowering the individuals inside of our company, whether they are a first year out of college person or a CEO, to be able to engage in a conversation with each other to broaden their perspectives. Also, the idea of unconscious bias and making it more of a topic. And I think sometimes we hear that word and we think it's a very, very bad thing, only bad people do. But if you think about it, right, all of us have biases because we are raised inside of a single community, right? And therefore we had to learn every other community through either assumptions or these big broad brushes. And so we all have a chance to learn about what the other group is in real life beyond our assumptions, right? And so if we think about the idea of it's a journey of learning about what the other group was, and therefore we can act as leaders in a more inclusive way. I think for me personally, what I see is the programs are important and they should be always there, but making it more individual. What can I do today to learn more about the other group? How can I find someone for me who is different in work and find a way to untap that person's potential, hopes and dreams so we can all be winning together has been powerful. And the last thing I'll say too is that, to the point made by Natasha earlier, our employees' average age is 27 years old.
Wow.
And as we are looking to hire folks into our company, they ask us first about what are we doing for the environment and social justice before they ask about salary and role, right? They want to see that we as a company, we have a personality, we have a sense of purpose and right and wrong. And they want to be a part of that energy, even above and beyond just a paycheck and a job title. So the world is changing around us, whether we're ready or not for it.
Absolutely. I want to ask you a follow-up question to that question, Kevin. But before I do want to remind our audience that we would invite your questions via our question and answer function, our question poll. So feel free to go ahead and put your questions there. It's the Q&A function. And so we'll be reviewing those throughout the hour and asking some of your real-time questions. As a follow-up, Kevin, I would ask, so you talked about this individualized approach to diversity and inclusion. Mm-hmm. Can you share just a little bit with us from your perspective as a leader, what you've done and how you show up in this space in order to be a champion for diversity and inclusion?
Yeah, and I think I'll use examples of last year where I saw what in my career as a diverse individual, a first in my entire career take place in our firm. And that was the way that we saw leaders modeling the conversation publicly. So I had a chance where it was myself and a colleague who was also a leader, white male, for example. And we were talking using I feel, I fear, I want language. I would share how I feel as a Black man walking into our firm after George Floyd was killed. I would share how I feel when I see a cop pull me over. I would share what I fear in terms of being judged, for either my appearance or whatever else. And he or she would also share things like, I didn't know that before you shared and told this to me. They would share things about, I now appreciate your concerns and that I can't assume that, things are either good or bad. And we began to model in my mind how the conversation happens in a very safe and non-threatening way among us as leaders. Because we found that most of our employees come to work every day with the intention to do the right thing. They really do. But many of them are afraid to broach these hot topics with good reason, quite frankly. But they really want to understand what does good look like. And I think making it safer for us to, as leaders, use this personalized, I feel, I think, I want, I fear language, or I learned this about you the other day kind of thing. Help to make a culture of the safe dialogue without finger pointing happen that I think began to transcend to our lower employees as one example of how it was more personalized.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. There's a question that I want both of you to take, or either of you. The question that we've been asked is, do your respective companies hold your vendors accountable work with vendors to address diversity and inclusion efforts? And if so, what does that relationship look like?
I can start by answering that question. So in the introduction, I did not mention where Ferrara is in our DEI journey. So we're very new in our DEI journey. I'm the first person in my role, and I joined in November of 2019, so just a few months before the global pandemic. So about 2 years now. We are in the early stages of establishing our supplier diversity program, which this would typically fall under supplier diversity initiatives. We have started the work of actually sizing our spend with the diverse suppliers that we work with and identifying what this relationship will look like in terms of expectations with vendors. Some of this is happening very informally. So for example, our employee resource groups, which are the employee-led networks that we have, they are mindful of working with a more diverse set of vendors and suppliers when they make the purchasing decisions that they make. But when you think about the broader span that really guides the entire organization, we don't fully have everything in place yet from a supplier diversity perspective, but we have started to map out what are the steps that we want to take. And it does include the 2 points that were asked in this question.
Thank you. Kevin, any thoughts on that particular question?
Yeah, no, I think it's interesting. So as a vendor ourselves, who we sell to companies, I will tell you, I've been intrigued to see how many of our clients raise that question with us. How many of our clients who are saying that they sell to diverse communities and therefore they want diverse vendors as well. And they'll ask questions about how diverse are we? And I think what I've observed is this, right? That if you truly believe that everyone is equal and everyone has the same potential, right, then you should see that diversity and equality in how you spend and hire and promote in most organizations. So it should be very simple, right? And therefore, it is a worthwhile metric to have that says, how diverse have we been, right, in terms of hiring and paying and promoting. And I do find that the conversation around challenging our own biases in terms of who we hire is a worthwhile one to have. And having that layered into how we select and choose how we spend, are we truly being diverse, or am I skewing towards a bias one way or another? I don't know that we have necessarily, quotas. But I do know that as leaders, we are tasked to challenge ourselves to make sure that our choices are not reflecting a bias that is not supported by performance. And I think as more and more consumers are raising their voices to say, if your practices as a company aren't diverse, I don't want to spend money with you. I think we're all more accountable to make sure that we are demonstrating that diversity follows all the way through. From the ads all the way to the back office of the companies. So,
absolutely.
Ayana, would it be okay if I go back to something that Kevin was also saying earlier before we go further into this
yes,
discussion?
Absolutely.
Yeah, Kevin, you're making some great points about just vulnerability among leadership, and I just wanted to add on to that because I think that really is important, especially following the events of 2020, where it just became so hard to separate, work from home. And as I look at the different backgrounds here, we might all be at home, and definitely spent a lot of time at home in the past year. And I absolutely agree with you that seeing leaders being more transparent, being more vulnerable really made a difference for Ferrara as well. And as I talked to my peers in this space, we actually added a 5th company value. Earlier this year, we added empathy as one of our company values, really building upon everything that we learned, experienced, and what we want to continue to foster in the organization. And when we described it to the organization, it was all around just embracing that unique perspective that everyone brings and continuing to have meaningful conversations with each other that foster inclusion, because it started with what was being role modeled at the top, and we saw more people having different, bolder, intimate conversations in the day-to-day, whether that was in one-on-ones or in team meetings or just in all of the different places that we come together and connect. And it really has transformed our DEI initiative because we've got goals, we've got commitments, we've got workforce data, we've got everything. But that part that is a little bit harder to measure is transformative when you have people that are just connecting in a way that they previously did not at work, and when they also see leaders role modeling the same.
Yeah, thank you for that as well. You know, you talked about this need for transparency with leadership as well as the vulnerability, and all of that is so important to having these conversations at work. One of the audience participants has asked a question with regard to how do we balance conversations, understanding that they are powerful, but how do we balance conversations with the increased interest in DEI metrics? How do we shake the balance between having these conversations and then also measuring our success?
Yeah, I can jump in here on this one. I do think, well, the first part is that the answer is you must do both. I do think that as business leaders, one thing that we have known for hundreds of years is that you give a business owner a metric and they will move mountains to get there, right? The question today has simply been, is D&I a worthwhile metric for most leaders today, right? But for every other thing that we do, we are given a metric and we will proudly profess to you how far we've come with it. Right. Mm-hmm. And if DEI matters, it should be there. But I do think because diversity, inclusion, and equity is dealing with humans, what you want to see happen is a much more organic outcome that doesn't feel like it was done for a number only. And therefore, the win occurs when you change the culture along with the metrics, I think. I think you truly want to try and find a way to get buy-in from all people that we're doing the right thing the right way with the right outcomes. And I think trying to find a way to have the metrics give you a guardrail for what good should look like, but the way to get there should feel more empowering, organic, and transparent and sincere along the way.
Absolutely. One other question that I think kind of helps to kind of bring this home is we understand that while the conversations also need to be had, there are also some things, and this is for you, Natasha, as we look out in the industry and the work that you do, there are certain perhaps common traits that organizations who are doing this well, things that they're doing and they're doing a good job, and we can look to those organizations perhaps to be able to say, in your organization, maybe try this or do this as you continue to advance D&I. What are the common traits do you see among organizations who are doing this work well?
Yeah, I can think of two right offhand. The first is those organizations that really do have like a learning culture, that is, fueled by curiosity, people willing to connect. And then the second is just leadership. I have so many peers across the space through my now decade of being in this work, and that really is the differentiator. I can say very candidly that, people in this work, we will stay or go based on a leadership change, because it just makes the difference in whether or not you can be successful. Your CEO, your senior leadership team, they really set the tone on whether or not this is a priority and whether or not it is given the emphasis as is every other business initiative, and not, treat it like something on the side. And, so when I say leadership, I mean just that. And then when I said learning, it really is just that kind of, organizational culture and aptitude for change and curiosity.
So a learning culture and leadership.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So another question, great questions coming in from the audience. Continue to keep your questions coming through the Q&A function. A question that we have for either of you, whoever wants to take this particular one, it asks, how does your organization manage the trauma that staff may experience through workplace DEI activities and conversations? and how do orgs manage staff wellness in this space, understanding that some of that does come along with the territory as we have these conversations about things we've never really talked about at work before. So how are your organizations managing that?
Wow, that's a very, very tough question. A good one, though. Something that was interesting that I heard someone say again last year was, she said, racism is trauma, right? Mm-hmm. And people walking into our work every day who literally have lives that are traumatic, a pervasive sense of trauma occurring since birth, right? You watch TV, you go with your parents to the store. There's so many instances of trauma occurs to someone who is of color that the default has been get over it and overcome and move forward, but it's still trauma, right? Something we heard people say last year that was difficult to hear our employees on our watch say, but and others were saying it too, was that coming to work and sharing about their trauma and being heard was like therapy. Now, I don't know that it's going to be safe for all employees to process trauma at work, but the point I'm trying to make is that there are some people for whom everyday life is traumatic, and simply being seen for what they're going through is in itself a relief of what they're going through. So I think that was one thing that I saw. We also began to use a lot more formal resources by giving our employees access to professional help during the course of last year. And I think a thin line between being inclusive and trying to be everyday therapists at work. But I think the ask that we heard everyone say, which is not a surprising ask, is simply being able to be seen. That when Monday morning comes and someone asks you how was your weekend, that thing you did that was very unique to you and your tribe, having room to share that, right? The TV shows you watched, or whatever it is that you did that was different and unique to your culture, family, or your person, whatever it was, having the culture of where you work be open to have that shared it goes a long, long way, which is why I think the real learning comes from being able to have a safe place to communicate and not judge each other. And finding where is the right place, because you have boundaries that can accommodate that without causing too much harm. I have this one person that for me, because we had so many groups in the country that were harmed by public things last year. And I found that for myself, I just became curious, even though I had my own experiences as a Black male, for example. I had, coworkers who were Asian, we had women, we had other groups who were going through trauma. And therefore I found that I could find myself, people who were police officers who were going through trauma last year too. I became curious. I became curious to ask individuals, how are you doing? How are you dealing with this? How can I help you with what you're going through? And demonstrate that it matters to me that something you're going through is traumatic, and how can I help? Was helpful. So.
I can add to that, and I appreciate everything that you just shared, Kevin. And I'll say that I'm on a personal journey with this. I've been, in the workplace now for more than 20 years, and where I started in dealing with situations that felt unique to myself is I had to process them outside of work with friends and with family. So if I wanted to talk to someone, it definitely happened as soon as I got in the car on the drive home, or, when I made it home. And that was my processing space. And I didn't work with anybody that looked like me. So that was one of the main reasons why it happened in that way. Then over time, throughout the years, I would, feel safe with people that looked like me to talk about what I was experiencing at work. But it was still like just those, 1, 2, 3 people that I felt comfortable and safe enough to share what I was thinking, feeling, processing with at work. And so then that became like stage 2 of talking about it at work, but it was just still with a very small group that was like myself. And now I've reached a stage where I will comfortably share still with people that I trust, but people that don't look like me, whether they are different gender, different race, combination of both. And so I've, now 2 decades into my career, am at this different place. And someone else might be in a different place. Newer generations coming into the workforce, have more immediate expectations to be able to process right away. And so there's no one size fits all. This is just my personal journey. But what I will say that we offered at Ferrara for our employees is processing spaces that were moderated by a licensed race, wellness, and mental therapist. And it was completely optional. People could join these calls, and it was a group with the licensed person. And we talked about everything. They were often scheduled like following like big things. So we had one that was after the Derek Chauvin verdict was when one was scheduled, because we knew that people might be processing. And it's like, do you want to process here? If you're still at work, do you want to process during this time? And we had people that joined. And so that was one way that we're just trying to like create a bridge for people to start like safely doing it, knowing that, we are not therapists, but just bringing someone in that can help support as we all decide and create comfort at work. And so we're just, I don't want to use the word experimenting. I'll just say piloting different things to see what is helpful. We also made the Calm app available to all of our employees for free. And so that's another just way of having something, a resource that people can use so that they have one other way of connecting to something that is a wellness outlet. And so we're just continuing to get suggestions from our employees on resources that might be helpful and available.
Can I add one thing to that? Because I think it's a very, very, very important point you made, Natasha, which is the fact that if someone is experiencing something that they would describe as trauma, I can't say enough that the right thing to do is to call a professional and get help with that. And that if you are at work and a coworker describes their experience as traumatic, that help them get help. I think when we say having the dialogue, to the point you just heard from Natasha, is, family and friends are probably your best place to process, truly process. I think for coworkers, there are certain boundaries too, but I can't underscore enough that, they make that free phone call to your employee helpline, whatever it is, because there truly is value in a trained professional truly walking you through some of those things you're going through, even beyond a coworker.
Thank you for adding that, Kevin. Staying a little bit with this particular topic with regard to everything that happened in our country last year and the conversations that really were sparked as a result of it. One of our audience participants asked the question with regard to, of course, there was a lot of initiatives in companies that were launched as a result of what happened with the George Floyd incident. And some of those initiatives that were launched with good intention, but perhaps there are some difficulty sustaining some of the programs that were launched as a result. So the question is, what advice do you have for those who are struggling to perhaps sustain and grow in their diversity, equity, and inclusion journey?
I can start. I think there could be myriad answers to this based on why they are struggling to sustain. It could be resources, like people resources, financial resources, like what commitment looks like could really vary. But what I have found to be the most helpful is listening to your employees, because usually they know what the barrier is. And so when we got started at Ferrara, that was the first thing that we did, was a listening tour to help us determine what the priorities should be as we got started. And that was really critical for us for year one. And then we had another listening tour actually during the pandemic. So as we were entering year two of our journey, but mid-pandemic, we had another listening tour to hear like, what are the priorities now and how should we pivot? How should we prioritize, invest? And we'll do it again coming up in Q1 of 2022 so that we are getting that feedback. And that listening tour is something that is through actual almost focus group moderated conversations. We also have employee engagement surveys that give us something a bit more quantitative, but I have just found that your employees usually know exactly what it is. And if you take the time and ask the people, they will be able to articulate what the barriers may be, because it could be financial commitment or something else that's getting in the way of sustainability.
I underscore all of that. And what I would add to that comment is that my views as someone who is a Black immigrant, and how my family had navigated the last 30 years. And when I think through why we chose to literally come to America and how we chose to navigate the last few years, one of the unique upsides of all of this, in my opinion, as a person of color, why I still think I want to be in this country is the fact that it's not the absence of bias that I think is attractive to me for being here. It's the fact that in most scenarios, when something unfair happens, you can raise your hand and say foul. And you will engage in the country and the process to say, hey, what really happened? How do you fix this thing going forward? Point being, I think, to answer your question, Joanna, I think we have to make sure that whatever we do, we retain that element of our programs, that we're able to check and adjust with the folks who are impacted to say, hey, is what we're doing enough? Are we following through? And if we're not, raise your hand and say foul. And let's keep moving forward. I think, I don't know if we'll ever see perfection in the work for D&I, but I think we have to make sure that we are checking in with the folks who are the stakeholders to see if what we are doing is right and if the outcomes are there. And if not, use our voice to say, let's do it again and get it right the next time, is what I would say.
Yeah, I like the idea, Kevin, of this ongoing calibration around the work that we're doing. How is it impacting our workforce and what meaningful, sustainable changes that we're seeing as a result of the work that we're doing?
Yep. And if not, correct it and keep going.
Absolutely. Then we course correct.
That's right.
I want to take us back just a little bit with regard to the question that I asked earlier. And so this is a question that's coming in from one of our audience participants with regard to vendor accountability. And what they're asking is they'd like to hear your thoughts about holding your own suppliers accountable, notably farmers. And what does that relationship look like? And do you have a relationship with farm member-based organizations with regard to vendor accountability? And either of you can take that.
I can start. As I mentioned, we are really early in our DEI journey and specifically on the supplier piece. And so the one thing that we are starting to do for that is the team has created a form around what are our expectations for our vendors. And it does have some key elements that we identified as best practices from, a leadership perspective, representation perspective, aspects of sustainability. So we have not implemented it yet, but we brought together a task force to help us to design what that will look like. But that's where we are because we're so early in our journey, but there are organizations that are a bit more mature, specifically in the supplier space, that are doing some things that are more sophisticated.
Yeah, I think we have a little bit more of an indirect approach to the supplier question there, given what we do as a company. One thing I will share that's interesting to me is many of our clients, in fact, do purchase from farmers and use the agri industry as well. I've been a little bit inspired, quite frankly, by what I'm seeing in the way that our clients are using technology to make it more equitable for different kinds of suppliers to engage with them. I've seen some really intriguing concepts around how to make the playing field much more level, whether you're a small farmer or a big farmer, whatever it is to plug in. And I think also too, we're continuing to see the way that we are brought in and the way that we show our supply of people be more diverse. One thing I will share that what we're doing is as a part of our supplier diversity program, we are investing in programs to help different kinds of companies qualify to work with us as entrepreneurs, whether it's women-owned, minority-owned, newer diverse-owned companies. And we mentor companies for up to 1.5 years or 2 through our programs to get them, supplier ready for either EY or somewhere else in many cases. So I think that we're seeing some very creative approaches to enable more diversity across the board.
So both of you spoke in your introductions about representation. So I want to shift us a little bit here and talk about what should organizations be doing today to increase their representation, but also to ensure that as individuals come into the organization, that they come into an inclusive culture. So if you could talk maybe just a little bit about your journey, whether that was through mentorship, sponsorship, what did that look like for both of you or either of you?
It's interesting because I think I mentioned before my journey of many years of going through being first only or one of few. And I still remember my first job after school was working in a bank. And I still recall seeing for the first time a senior person who's a Black man in banking 30 years ago, whatever it was. And the impact it had on me where I could suddenly see myself in that role because he looked like me type thing. I think it's one of the most underscored, undervalued strategies in D&I is the impact of having leaders who look like your people. And the way that it inspires them to unleash themselves, see a path forward, mentoring both directly and indirectly in different ways. I think it has to be a very important part of your strategy is visibly connecting the individuals who you're trying to impact positively with role models who look like them, they can relate to in different ways. It really helps them change their mindset in a very powerful way.
Yeah.
Yes, and I'll just I'll add to that. We identified 3 priorities when we started our journey, and we sometimes call it the 3 Ps: people, product, and purpose. And it helps us to prioritize first what we're doing with our workforce and our workplace. And so that's everything from being transparent with our workforce data, which is on our company website, setting those goals and those commitments, which are also public. From a product perspective, it's thinking about inclusive marketing, not marketing on stereotypes. And then from a purpose perspective, is thinking about how we connect with the right partnerships in our community so that we are just supporting efforts right in our backyard and really focusing on eliminating inequity, systemic racism, and oppression in all forms. And so that's people, product, and purpose for us. And so over the past nearly 2 years now, we have been, finding partnerships, investing in our employee resource groups, because they really do help us to leverage the full power of our employees to move forward the right initiatives that support different marginalized groups. We launched a diversity, equity, and inclusion council that includes our CEO and his entire executive team, as well as a representative group across functions and departments in the organization to support the DEI strategy. So we're bringing more voices and people to the table. We did also launch a mentoring program, which is connecting people, supporting the development of our employees, just to name a few of the things that were really critical to us as an organization that was just getting started in this journey. And as we look ahead, those were things that were a bit more, I would say, programmatic in nature. It was almost like, what do you need to do to just be solid in a DEI strategy? We know that we need to make sure that we have the right systems in place, because we can have all of the right programs, but we also know that we really need to be moving towards systemic change. And so we also are looking at how decisions are made from a hiring perspective, from a development perspective, from a promotion perspective, every aspect of the employee experience as well. So we're looking at programmatic elements as well as systemic changes. And that's kind of where we are in this journey as an organization.
Thank you. So as we move closer to the top of the hour, I have several questions that have come in. And so I want to give you an opportunity to answer one or more of them, depending on the time that we have. So 2 that I want to put in front of both of you is perhaps what is one immediate thing that participants can do to positively impact racial justice, inclusion, and diversity in the industry? So you can take either that one, or another question is kind of more of a visionary question, and that is, what does success look like for DEI in the food industry in the next 12 months? So you can take either of those 2 questions that are on the table for you all.
Maybe I'll take one of these, then I'll go first this time. I think success for DEI is continued progress and continued awareness and conversation. I do think that DEI, you can't have high performance if you don't have diverse workforces. The number I love to quote, which I saw in a report once, is that when an employee has a diverse background, does not feel like they belong in the company, they produce up to 30% less than they could have if they felt like they belonged, right? Think through, there are not many things a company can do to invest in anything they do that will yield that kind of return on output, right? So seeing DEI not just as a answer the call, but as a way to truly get your company high performing, because you want all your employees to unleash. And so I think you'll see in successful companies that the individuals who are successful inside the company look more and more diverse because the company are more belonging. So leave that one there.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Natasha, which one of those would you like to tackle before the hour's up?
Yeah, I want to pile into to that one as well. Just going back to where I had started this conversation around just food being relevant for every single person. And I do believe that there is at least a perception that other industries are doing more with DEI than food. I think you talk about DEI and people think about technology. They think about these other industries that may not even have the representation, to be honest, in their workforce. And I see a tremendous opportunity for food to lead the way in our communities, in our advertising, and our packaging, every single thing that I had said at the beginning. And I love what you were just saying, Kevin, around, the more diverse the workforces are, and the more people feel empowered, diverse individuals feel empowered to bring themselves, the better you'll see outcomes, the better the decision-making will be as a result of that. And so to me, what I see as success for food is to be the leader around DEI and thinking for our communities. And we can go so far as to say for this country. I really see like the leaders of these organizations, the CEOs of retailers and of food manufacturers leading the thinking for DEI, like right there for this nation. We've got so much data and information about people and about what people want, what people buy. And so I just feel like there's so much there that we haven't really tapped into that we could as an industry.
Yeah. Thank you, Natasha. So as we wrap up, I'm going to give each of you 30 seconds. Any closing thoughts that you want to share with our audience before we wrap up for the afternoon? Closing thoughts, maybe 30 seconds, either of you or both of you.
Want to go first?
My closing thought would just be that, the one-to-one connections really matter. And you'd ask, like, what can we do? What can each person do? And I think those one-to-one connections really matter. And so if you think about how to build a more inclusive culture, it starts like just one conversation at a time.
Like today.
I'll say amen to that. I think just seek out people who you don't know because they're different from you and talk to them. Just talk to them, get to know them. It's the biggest cure for much of this we're going through right now, is to expand your personal connection to individuals who you might view today as different or an other in some respect.
Thank you, Kevin. And thank you to our audience participants. We did try and get to as many questions as we could as possible, understanding there were more time than what we could get to. So again, thank you for your audience questions. As we wrap up, I want to again just thank both Kevin and Natasha for being here with us today to have this conversation. We also want to refer you back to those 4 agreements of courageous conversation. We do know that as you take the conversation from today out into your workforce, your personal and professional lives, these agreements can also support conversations beyond today. So we would refer you back to those as you continue the conversation in your workplace. Also, we want to remind you to watch out for CFI emails and social media to learn more about CFI, FMI, RJID initiatives. Through events like today's digital dialogue, this initiative will highlight examples of companies doing an excellent job regarding racial inclusion and diversity. So we invite you to continue to look for opportunities to engage with CFI and FMI in this way, no matter where you are on your journey. Then finally, for those interested in continuing this journey, you can find more resources at foodintegrity.org. Again, that's foodintegrity.org. So again, thanks to Natasha and Kevin. That's all that we have for today. And thank you all today for participating in today's dialogue. On behalf of CFI and FMI, have a great afternoon.